St Helens, a town in a state of change. But change has always been a way of life for a town that was quite literally built on coal, glass and pills. Unfortunately, it also relied on this small handful of industries to provide most of its employment. Like many places that relied on just a few large employers, the town now looks to diversify into new industries and new areas of work. But the past has left St Helens with many fine buildings reflecting a proud industrial heritage. The casual observer might think that St Helens had sprung up overnight at the height of the Industrial Revolution, but there's actually been a settlement here since the 14th century. One of the oldest buildings in the town is the Quaker Meeting House. The Quakers came to the area at the end of the 17th century and, lacking a church, they converted this former barn in the Hardshaw area into their place of worship. The simply decorated, even sparse nature of the building reflects the simplicity and purity that they looked for in their faith. One of the most famous buildings in St Helens today, and one which dominates the town centre skyline, is the former Beecham's factory in Westfield Street. For nearly a century and a half, the Beecham's name and the production of pills and medicines has been synonymous with St Helens. Thomas Beecham arrived in Lancashire in the middle of the 19th century. Although initially based in Wigan, he soon moved his family and his business to St Helens. Joined by his son Joseph, the fast expanding company was soon buying land for a brand new factory. Before long, Beecham's pills were on sale in every druggist in the country, thanks to Joseph's skill in the new art of advertising. Local people were employed in ever greater numbers. The company gained a reputation for treating its workers hard but fairly, with innovations such as free cocoa and tea helping to maintain company loyalty. Throughout the years, the business continued to grow, and a new factory was built on the Westfield Street site in the ornate and popular Queen Anne style. The building cost a staggering £30,000. With its 150-foot high clock tower, it was one of the first factories to be powered by the newfangled electricity. The company went from strength to strength. This footage from the 1950s shows employees hand-making pills in a way that was largely unchanged from the methods employed by Thomas Beecham nearly a century before. It was all a far cry from the high-tech computer control methods that were to be seen in the factory some 40 years later. Products like Beecham's Hot Lemon, Night Nurse and Yeast Fight are still household names, and all were manufactured on the site right up to its closure in late 1994. At this time, precise plans for the historic building had yet to be drawn up, but it's hoped that in whatever form, the bells of the landmark clock tower will continue to ring out over the town for many years to come. Coal mining was the second of St Helens' great industries. At its height, the mining industry in the St Helens area was made up of over 35 separate collieries. This very early film from 1910 shows scenes from a typical working day in a St Helens mine. At the start of each shift, every miner would collect his Davy lamp before getting into cramped cages for the long dark descent to the coalface. Hours were long and conditions at the face were backbreaking, with everything having to be done by hand. On the surface, things weren't much better. By the end of the 19th century, legislation had ensured that women and children were no longer sent underground, and one result was that the hand sorting and grading of coal was frequently undertaken by colliers' wives. These rare scenes show women colliery workers from the St Helens area undertaking a whole range of surface tasks, including shifting pit props, sorting the coal on a conveyor, and moving around the heavy coal tubs. It was not uncommon for whole families, mothers, fathers and children, to work at the same pit. Wages could be less than 3 shillings for a week's work. This happy ending, with the miner returning home to his happy family, is perhaps a little fanciful. In reality, days were long, and miners would often leave home and return in the dark. This was all in stark contrast with the scenes in this film from the 1960s, when things had certainly changed. The cutting and moving of coal had been almost completely mechanized. But with one machine doing the work of many men, the numbers employed in the industry were already starting to fall. For the coal communities, the pit was often the center of people's lives, not only in work but also in play. Here we see fleets of buses gathered to bring miners from all over the northwest to the Lancashire Miners' Gala. The year is 1960, and the event is being hosted by Bold Colliery, one of the biggest in the St Helens area. Trade union banners are proudly marched through the streets, and even the typical Lancashire weather wasn't going to dampen the spirits. No parade was complete without a brass band, many of which were made up of colliery workers. But such events were more than parades for the miners. Whole families would come along to participate in an event that was part sports day and part carnival. The 1960 gala managed to draw at least one soon-to-be famous visitor. Sports, games, a travelling fairground and traditional Lancashire Morris dancing were all on show for the thousands of visitors who thronged to the event. In the background, you can see the many chimneys that made up the St. Helens skyline. And, a rare sight these days, a beauty contest. The proud winner is given the sash that names her as Miss Lancashire Miners Gala 1960. Glassmaking has been going on in St. Helens since the arrival in the town of the British Plate Glassmaking Company in 1773. At one time, the area could boast 15 glassworks. It is, however, the name of William Pilkington, who came to St. Helens in 1826, that has made glassmaking in the town famous throughout the world. In this extremely rare film, we can see the arrival of King George V and Queen Mary at the Pilkington Brothers Cowley Hill Works in 1913. Note the formal clothes and especially the ladies' large hats. The party moves on for a tour of the factory, the most modern of its day. At a time when the British Empire stretched around the world, Pilkington glass was already being exported to all 5 continents. This much later footage shows the skill of the glassmakers at work. The traditional practice of blowing the glass is much in evidence. Here, glass battery boxes are being hand-blown into rough shape. The still molten glass is then formed into a box by pressing into a mould. The surplus glass around the neck is removed first by breaking, then by cutting before the edge is ground down smooth. Despite the high level of traditional skill required to make such complex objects, the manufacture of plate glass was by now highly mechanized. Here we see a sheet being pulled upwards from a pool of molten glass. The ribbon of glass is scored by a cutter and the sheet separated and carried away before being trimmed down to size. Along with the collieries, the Pilkington Company was a major sponsor of public events in the town. Events such as this Pensioners' Day held at Ruskin Drive in 1960, where proud owners set out to prove that St Helens is a town of dog lovers. Another Pilkington-sponsored event, once again at Ruskin Drive during the long hot summers of the early 60s. Fruit and flowers are proudly displayed. Children burn off some energy in the sports. For those of more mature years, there are the gentler pastimes of cricket and bowls. While for others, games of a slightly more unusual nature are the favourite of the day. Nearby Prescott in the 1930s, and we see a series of parades from the era as the locals let their hair down. Prescott Carnival Parade about 1937 provided an excuse for building elaborate floats. And for some of the town's more eccentric residents to show off before the community. A more sober occasion and weather to match, a parade including local councillors of the Urban District Council of Prescott, as it was then known. It was accompanied by a brass band, an essential part of any parade and a familiar sight in towns throughout the northwest. At one time there were said to be as many as 16 brass bands in the St Helens area, and an annual contest was held at Denton's Green. Another Prescott parade, also in the late 30s, this time children on a Whitsunday walk, complete with the traditional Rose Queens. How many of these young Prescott children are still living in the area today? Many would now be close to drawing their pension. The mood of the parade changes to a show of strength as the army brings out the crowds just prior to the Second World War. Could this be the South Lancashire Battalion of the Territorial Army, who've had a long connection with the St Helens and Prescott area? Processions, whether for a great occasion or just an ordinary church parade, would always draw a large crowd. In the background, you may just make out the front of Tara's department store. The Prescott branch has closed, but the company is still going strong in nearby St Helens. Another parade of councillors. Such parades of civic dignitaries seemed a far more common sight before the war. Local groups and societies were always well represented in such events. Does anyone recognise the organisations that these youngsters in uniform might belong to? Many processions were a prelude to a sports or gala day. This impromptu game seems to be a variation on the French sport of boulet. Raining again, and another civic parade in Prescott, this time in the late 1930s. Once again, uniformed organisations are much in evidence. One of the most familiar names on the St Helens High Street is Tara's. The Tara's department store on Bridge Street has been serving the people of the town for over 100 years.
Welcome to Tara's. I'm John Tyra, the present chairman and managing director. Tara's was founded in 1888 by my grandfather, William Tinsley Tyra, known to his many friends as Will. He was a man with a great reputation for honesty and integrity, and he started his small business at the foot of Liverpool Road in a single shop. He had £50 and a box of footwear given him by a friend. Fortunately, the business prospered from the start, and it grew and grew. Eventually, in the 1920s, Will Tyra was joined by his three sons, John, Ratcliffe and Eric. Over the years, we have experimented with branches in different places, and one of the first branches we opened was our Prescott shop, and we've traded in Prescott for many, many years, and indeed old Prescotians still today refer to Tyra's in Prescott. During the 1950s, we were informed that our building in Liverpool Road would have to be demolished for road improvement. Fortunately, we were able to acquire the present site in Bridge Street, and in 1960 we opened a purpose-built department store. We have traded well here in Bridge Street, and in 1979 we continued the process of development and added another floor to provide a studio restaurant and hairdressing salon. I believe that shops and shopping to be an essential part of the social life of a community. And the Satira family have always taken an interest in St Helens and its life. In 1951, for the Festival of Britain, the town held a show in the town hall in which we participated, and we also provided a fashion parade in a marquee in the town centre. In 1968, we took part in the procession. Over the years, we have tried to bring to St Helens something a bit out of the ordinary in the way of clothing and fashion. And I feel that the success of the business proves that our ideas have been right, coupled with the tradition of service and value established by my grandfather Will. Recently, my daughter Ali has decided to come into the business and join me, and she firmly believes in these old ideals and will continue in the tradition of her great-grandfather Will Tyrer.
Crowds gather for a number of street processions from the late 50s and early 60s. By the time this film was shot, life in the traditional back-to-back terraced houses was already beginning to disappear. As the town thrived and prospered in the 19th century, the demand for workers' housing had grown steadily. The now familiar rows of terraces were springing up all over the town. Many of these streets would soon be cleared to make way for new estates. During the 60s especially, whole communities would be uprooted and moved. St Helens gained its town status in 1868 with the granting of its municipal charter, and 100 years later the citizens were determined to celebrate the civic centenary. A great procession took over the whole town. Huge amounts of time, effort and imagination were put into making elaborate floats on every imaginable theme. Weeks of work for just one day's celebration. Even Lady Pilkington herself got in on the act, driving an ultra-modern motor car fitted, of course, with the revolutionary Pilkington glass. With so many participants, it's surprising that there was anyone left to watch. Were you here in 1968? Look carefully, because you or your friends may be in the film. Would your children or grandchildren recognize you? And finally, the Red Devils parachute display team drops in to be greeted by the 1968 Centenary Queen. One thing that would continue to hold the community together was the town's passion for rugby league. The Saints have been the pride of the town since their breakaway from the rugby union at the end of the last century. As many as 30,000 fans once turned out to welcome the team home from their victory in the Rugby League Cup final in 1956 when they beat Halifax.
Halifax in the hoop jerseys kick off against St Helens in the Rugby League Cup final at Wembley. St Helens scrum half Rhodes has the ball. He back heels to McIntyre, back to Cornelius, but Coyote stops him. Halifax attacking. Nearly stopped, but not quite. Out to Lynch, Lynch to Palmer, and Palmer's down. Wilkinson passes to Henderson, who dodges McIntyre and starts to run. But a Frank Carlton's there and brings him down. The ball's loose. Parsons grabs it, but Daniels tackles him. Half-time and still no score. In the second half, St Helens put on the pressure. Aurelius is pulled down, but passes to Carlton, and he's down too. Skipper Prescott makes a few yards. From a scrum down, St Helens get the ball away. Left winger Carlton races for the line. Halifax try to stop him, but he's made it. Scrum half Rhodes takes the kick and converts by inches. Finnan to Parsons, on to Rhodes. Now St Helens are really moving. Silcock to Greenall. He tries to run, but he's cornered and passes to Llewellyn, and Llewellyn scores. Once again, Rhodes converts, and St Helens are leading 10-0. Rhodes struggled to break through again, but he stopped, and so is Daniels. Penalty to Halifax just saves them from a whitewashing by 2 points. A few minutes to go, and Cornelius passes to Prescott, who bulldozes through for a wonderful try. No luck with the conversion, but the cup is St Helens by a 13-2 victory. So who cares about a couple of points? Skipper Prescott is hoisted aloft by his team, jubilant after their first ever Wembley triumph.
The Saints went on to beat local rivals Wigan 12-6 in the 1961 final, and again in 1966, a 21-2 victory at Wembley Stadium. Among the try scorers were the great names of Murphy, Mantle and Killeen. The team is still going strong today. In the 1950s, there were 2 royal visits. On April the 3rd, 1950, as part of a tour of Lancashire, which included Manchester and Warrington, Princess Margaret visited St Helens. On October the 25th, 1954, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh visited the town as part of their tour of Lancashire. St Helens is also famous for being at the centre of the railway revolution due to the famous Rainhill locomotive trials of 1829, an event that swept the name of Stephenson's rocket into railway legend. A large mural was painted depicting scenes from the 1829 trial. There was a carnival atmosphere as houses and streets were decorated, and floats were constructed for a great procession. Many of the floats took railway themes with models of famous engines, and one locomotive in particular, made by local children, seemed to be the star of the show. The Rainhill trials were endurance tests for early locomotives, with the winners looking to gain major contracts to supply the ever-growing railway network. A lot was at stake. Back in the 1820s, Rainhill was just a quiet village. But in 1979, the people of the small town were enthusiastically joining in the preparations for the biggest event in the area since the original trials. Enthusiasts, leaders of the modern railway industry and the media converged on the town. For a few days, Rainhill would once again be the centre of the railway world. The following year, 1980, 150 years after the introduction of the first passenger service between the great cities of Liverpool and Manchester, famous engines from across the country started arriving for the great cavalcade of steam. 30 historic locomotives ready for the big event were marshalled in sidings close to Bold Colliery. Finally, in front of thousands of onlookers, the three-day event began. The whole of railway history was represented. Among the many famous engines were Lion, a veteran of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway from 1838. Hardwick was one of the fastest engines in its day, reaching 67 miles an hour, a staggering speed for 1895. Even modest colliery engines like Robert, once a common sight, have a proud place in the parade. On the subject of speed, the sleek and powerful lines of the Sir Nigel Gresley, made to the same design as Mallard, the engine which still holds the world record as the fastest steam locomotive ever. Modern-day trains were also well represented, with an early appearance of the now familiar Intercity 125. And the ill-fated APT, the Advanced Passenger Train, which, despite its 21st century technology, was short-lived in service. Helped along by a modern 08 shunter, a replica of the early loco Sans Péril. And pride of place in the parade, the engine that everyone had come to see. Rocket is probably one of the best-known steam engines of all time, and in 1979, a full-size replica, complete with a copy of its original coach, steamed along the straight at Rainhill. From its origins as a small settlement in the 14th century, through the great industrial period to the troubles of recent times, St Helens has seen many changes. Today, the town has grown to a thriving borough of over 180,000 people. Much of the past has been cleared away, but the best of the area's heritage has been and will continue to be preserved. Efforts are underway to revitalise the town, and with good communications and an eager workforce, St Helens can look forward to a bright future.
We produce other local videos in the Pleasure Past series for your enjoyment. Liverpool, memories of a vibrant city in the 1920s and 1930s. Wirral, memories of the 1920s and 1930s. Chester memories from the 1920s up to today. The Mersey Tunnels, 60 years, 1934 to 1994. The story of Birkenhead Tramways, 1860 to 1993. Liverpool echoes of the 1940s and 1950s. Liverpool, the swinging 60s. A Liverpool Christmas. Southport, memories of a seaside town. Mersey Rail, 25 years, 1969 to 1994. Wirral, memories of the 1960s and 1970s. We're constantly looking for films suitable for inclusion in our video programs. If you have any or know of any, please tell us. We'll be very willing to view them.